Well, that sort of struck me when I was rereading Crick, the section of Crick in preparation for this, was that Orwell had just come from a very romanticised version of his own poverty, having written Keep the Aspidistra Flying as a struggling artist, and then he'd gone and experienced poverty in Wigan. It was a very sort of different thing. That, yeah, a lot of artists have fed on a version of poverty as well, and so that's very interesting.
Well, and what's interesting about that also, in terms of the genres that he chose to write in, one of the things about truly abject poverty is it doesn't give itself to narrative very easily. I mean, things just keep happening in the same way, and there's not like a kind of nice plot arc. Like if you go to the cinema and you see a film, right, it starts somewhere and then something happens, climactic, and then, you get somewhere else. Being a coal miner doesn't maybe give itself to novel writing the same way that being a kind of struggling would-be novelist and Keep the Aspidistra Flying would, right? You can write a novel about, I think I'm really a poet and I want to get the girl, but it's hard to get her back to my boarding house, this sort of thing. But so it's interesting when he shifted to writing about real poverty rather than sort of the genteel poverty of cities, of being a literary man who was kind of a hack, who was kind of hard up, he would switch from fiction to nonfiction. Right, because you can do that. You can describe what coal miners do, but it's very hard to make a novel out of their lives. I mean, some people, Dickens was good at this. But if you read Dickens, look to see what he has to do to make those things into stories. Right, there's often sort of fantastical elements that sort of jump into the stories and then make them into stories. Because otherwise, it's just a guy in a coal mine coming home and being very dirty and eating dinner and going to sleep every night. It's not much of a story, right?
Well, I think now maybe we're returning to one of the central questions, returning to the point of why we're here, Orwell and his successors. Then maybe each of the panellists could say what they think Orwell's successors should be doing today, because he was part of the movement that sort of pushed up, that changed things in 1936. So if each of you could say what you think, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Can I just say that I think, for me, Orwell writes about the secrecy of poverty, and I think that's one of the most harmful things of poverty. It excludes people. And I think Orwell's successors, an important role is to bring disadvantaged communities back into sight. And I think Stephen talks about Eileen in his book, An Older Woman, and so the list of her troubles is so long it's hard to get a perspective on them. It's easy to lose sight of the person amidst the pain. And I think on a macro level, society was so overwhelmed because there's so many people disadvantaged, it's easier not to see them. And I think we need to bring them back into sight as a starting point and hear it from them.
Who's next?
I think there are those answers. What I'll do really briefly is talk about this from Barbara Nettleton in Wigan, who in Skulls runs the community centre in Skulls, who used to run a residents association and then decided that people weren't interested in the newsletter. So started teaching manga classes in the community centre and developed an art club called Art to Art in Wigan, and really you should go. In November they're going to have their art show. They've been going 3 or 4 years now. They started off with it's probably about half the size of this. They started off the first year, there was a few paintings on the wall. By the time I went up, they had to get a marquee outside because the whole place is filled with paintings. It's like the Pittman painters all over again. It's the most incredible thing. And there are kids who are going there learning how to draw, then deciding that graphic design might be a career for them when they previously never considered the thing because the place where they lived had no jobs. So she gets no funding, she gets no council funding, she gets no government funding. They're sort of self-funding, they pull together what they can. And she says, I won't read it, but she goes into a thing about how really education should go through community centres like that, because they know the needs of the area, they know how to educate and train kids for what they need to do, how to get people out of the area, how to people will never give us the money, people will never let us set our own money or our own agenda, because it will all be centrally, the central government will run these things, and it won't allow, because what they don't want is people having control over their own destinies, and having their own ideas. And I mean, one thing that I did, and I think that anyone here could do, is went back there and started to try to teach writing to people, to 14, 13-year-olds. Partly because what Jacqueline was saying is that people talking about their own experiences is cathartic in loads of ways. Not just because people can write about the grimness of poverty, but because a story written by someone who's lived that life, even if it's an adventure story or an action hero story, will be different to the story that, you know, low middle class idiot like me would write. So that kind of wealth of voices that the grammar school kids brought out, you know, the Melvin Braggs, if you like. There's no more Melvin Braggs, because that whole generation has been removed now from the educational system, which is now essentially private. 7% of all schools in the UK are private, and 25% of all money that goes on education is spent in private education. So there's this gradual increasing removal of people from just talking about life. So I think that if we're all sitting around as a literary festival educated audience nodding and frowning and saying something ought to be done, then we can do it. I mean, that's the thing, is that it's not enough to simply say, well, something should be done. And I think that's what Orwell did when he finished Road to Wigan Pier. He went off and he fought. In the Spanish Civil War, he fought for what he believed in. You know, he took gunfire. And we can't do that. But we can do stuff. You know, there are people who are having bailiffs come around their house with the police to take their furniture and take their TVs as they've fallen behind on a hire purchase agreement. And this is illegal. The police aren't allowed to take part in this, but it happens all the time. The state is actively colluding in stealing people's property. There are little things that you can do, and so the next time you're thinking of doing something, then do it, really do it, get involved. And I think that's the thing that you could most take away from here, is that you can go out, you can talk to people, you can get stuff done.
Yeah, for me, I would say we should have a rebirth and spread the word of Orwell's work and the legacy, and actually pass it down to the young people. And we should have more young people in the audience. Until this week, speaking to a lot of young people that are classed as macho gang members, they all secretly know who Orwell is, and I was surprised. But it was looked on like, I know who he is, but don't tell anybody. and that's the code that we need to break with the young people, and it is needed for today, it is relevant for today, the work that he's done, and actually hand that down to the young people, so it's not a lost generation where once we've heard the word, no one else knows of the great work that he's done. So it's all about spreading the word to the next generation coming up, and it should be a part of the national curriculum, just like Shakespeare. And it should be pushed forward, and each of us in this room, just the amount of us in here, could actually do something to push that forward. And I think we should.
I'm afraid I really don't have anything as inspiring as any of that. What I really like about Orwell, and rereading this book this week, what I'm reminded every time I read Orwell, but what I'm reminded of is what I love about him is that, look, I mean, any people can go and try to write about people who aren't them, and lots of people do, right? These novelists, go and try to write about, if they come from a wealthy background, they try to write about poor people, fine. What's really wonderful about him is how self-reflective he is about what he's doing, and how self-aware he is as he writes about poverty and things like that. How aware he is of his sort of Etonian background and what that means, and why that might at once drive him to do this sort of project, but also to get it wrong in certain ways. And this isn't anywhere near as inspirational as what other people have said, but if there's a good thing to take away from this book or from Orwell in general, it would be, I wish we had writers who are more self-reflective in that way, and sort of more self-aware, because writing is a class thing. I mean, poor people get to do it, but go look at your Guardian and check out the class background of the people who write the columns for it, and that's the left-leaning paper, right?